The air in the Charlottesville courthouse was thick enough to choke on, heavy with the unspoken prejudice that clung to the polished wood and stern portraits of judges long dead. "Let's get this over with," Judge William Hardin muttered, his voice dripping with disdain as he glanced at the clock. "Frankly, Mr. Bailey, I have a golf match at 2, and this case feels like a colossal waste of taxpayer money." He smirked, looking down from his elevated bench at the lone figure at the defendant's table. "Another car thief. How original." Laughter, sharp and cruel, rippled through the prosecution's side of the room. But Darius Cole, 19 years old and facing the monolithic weight of the system, simply straightened his tie, his gaze unwavering. The storm outside was brewing, but inside he was the calm at its center. The incessant drumming of rain against the tall, arched windows of the Charlottesville courthouse on May 15, 2023, was a miserable percussion to an already somber affair. The sky outside was a bruised, unforgiving gray, casting the courtroom in a permanent state of twilight that the fluorescent lights overhead fought a losing battle to dispel. The room itself was a relic of an older time, a chamber of judgment where mahogany panels drank the light, and the air tasted of old paper and stale coffee. It was a place designed to make one feel small, insignificant, a cog in a machine far older and more powerful than any single life. For Darius Cole, sitting straight-backed at the defendant's table, that feeling was a tangible pressure against his chest. He was 19, but the set of his jaw and the quiet intensity in his dark eyes belonged to someone who had lived far longer. His suit, a charcoal gray borrowed from his uncle, was a size too big in the shoulders but worn with a dignity that made the ill fit seem irrelevant. He was an island of composure in a sea of barely veiled contempt. Across the room, Assistant District Attorney Ethan Bailey was the very picture of confidence. His suit was tailored, his blonde hair was perfectly coiffed, and his smile was a weapon. A sharp, gleaming thing he used to dismiss, to belittle, to win. He shuffled his papers with a theatrical flair, a man performing a role he'd played 100 times, certain of its conclusion. Presiding over it all was Judge William Hardin, a man whose face seemed permanently etched into a scowl of cynical impatience. His white hair was thin, his jowls heavy, and his eyes, magnified by his reading glasses, missed nothing and forgave less. He saw the world in black and white, guilty and not guilty, and had little time for the gray areas where justice often lived. He'd already sized up Darius Cole, young, black, from the wrong side of town, and filed him away in a mental cabinet overflowing with similar cases. To Judge Hardin, this was just another Tuesday morning, another number on the docket, another inconvenience standing between him and the manicured greens of the Farmington Country Club. "Mr. Cole," the judge began, his voice a gravelly monotone that scraped across the silence. "You are charged with grand larceny for the theft of a 2021 Lexus ES 350, felony evading, and resisting arrest. These are serious charges. I see you have waived your right to a public defender. A foolish decision, but your right nonetheless. Are you prepared to enter a plea?" Before Darius could speak, Ethan Bailey rose smoothly to his feet. "Your Honor, the state is prepared to present overwhelming evidence. We have the arresting officer's testimony, fingerprints matching the defendant from the vehicle's steering wheel, and surveillance footage of him fleeing the scene. It's an open and shut case." He glanced at Darius, his expression a cocktail of pity and derision. A murmur went through the gallery, a sparse collection of cynical court watchers and a few of Darius's neighbors, their faces etched with worry. In the front row sat his mother, Maya Angelou Cole. She was a pillar of strength, her back ramrod straight, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She had raised Darius on the words of her namesake, teaching him that courage was the most important of all the virtues, because without courage, you can't practice any other virtue consistently. Her presence was a silent, powerful anchor for him. She had spent a lifetime as an activist and educator, fighting the very system that now sought to swallow her son whole. She had taught him to read law books, not for a degree, but for survival. She had instilled in him a righteous fire, a belief that the truth, if wielded with precision and courage, could be a sword. Judge Hardin sighed, tapping his pen on the bench. Mr. Bailey, thank you for the preview. Mr. Cole, the floor is yours. How do you plead? The courtroom held its breath. Every eye was on the young man who seemed so utterly outmatched. His voice, when it came, was not the timid whisper they expected. It was clear, steady, and resonant, filling the space with an unexpected authority. Not guilty, Your Honor, Darius said. Hardin raised a skeptical eyebrow. Very well. And who will be representing you in this endeavor? The sarcasm was thick, intended to sting. Darius met the judge's gaze without flinching. The whispers in the courtroom grew louder, a hiss of disbelief. Maya closed her eyes for a brief moment, sending a silent prayer into the oppressive air. This was it. The moment of truth. I will be representing myself, Your Honor. The statement dropped into the room like a stone in a silent pond. The ripples of shock were immediate. Ethan Bailey let out a short, incredulous laugh. A court officer shook his head slowly. In the gallery, jaws went slack. Even Judge Hardin seemed, for a fraction of a second, taken aback. The derisive smirk returned almost instantly, but it was sharper now, laced with a fresh layer of disbelief. You? The judge scoffed, leaning forward over his bench, the full weight of his authority bearing down on the teenager. Son, this isn't a high school debate club. This is a court of law. People go to prison, for a very long time, when they lose in here. You have no training, no experience. You are, with all due respect, a child playing dress-up in his uncle's suit. The insult was public, brutal, and designed to break him before he even began. The laughter it elicited from the prosecution's table was like salt in a wound. But Darius did not break. He did not flush with anger or shrink in shame. He simply stood his ground, his hands resting lightly on the polished table before him. He had anticipated the mockery, the doubt, the towering wall of prejudice. His mother had prepared him for it. Let them underestimate you, she had always said. Let them see a boy. Then show them a man. With all due respect, Your Honor, Darius replied, his tone perfectly even, perfectly respectful, yet underscored with a current of steel. The Sixth Amendment guarantees me the right to counsel. It does not, however, require me to believe that the counsel provided by the state, in a system that so often sees people who look like me as guilty until proven innocent, would represent my best interests. I know the facts of this case better than anyone. I know I am innocent. And I believe I am the only one in this room who will fight for that innocence with everything I have. He paused, letting his words hang in the air. I am ready to proceed. Judge Hardin stared at him, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. It might have been annoyance, or perhaps the faintest glimmer of grudging respect for the boy's sheer nerve. He leaned back in his chair, a slow, theatrical motion. The game, it seemed, was afoot. Very well, Mr. Cole, he said, the corner of his mouth twitching. Proceed. Let's see what you've got. The Commonwealth of Virginia versus Darius Cole is now in session. Mr. Bailey, you may call your first witness. As Ethan Bailey swaggered to the podium, a smug look on his face, Darius took a deep breath. He glanced at his mother. She met his gaze and gave him a nearly imperceptible nod, a silent transfer of a lifetime of love and strength. The gavel's echo had faded, but a new sound was beginning to fill the courtroom. The quiet, determined voice of Darius Cole. Ethan Bailey called his first witness. Officer Marcus Ruiz, a burly, mustached patrolman who carried himself with the heavy-shouldered weariness of a man who had seen too much and expected the worst. Bailey led him through the testimony with practiced ease, painting a clear and damning picture. "Officer Ruiz," Bailey began, his voice smooth and persuasive, "could you please describe the events of the evening of April 28th? Ruiz cleared his throat, his eyes fixed on a point on the back wall, never once looking at Darius. "We received a call about a stolen vehicle, a late-model Lexus, spotted heading east on Preston Avenue. My partner and I initiated a pursuit. The driver was reckless, speeding, running a stop sign. He eventually ditched the car in the parking lot of the Rose Hill apartment complex and fled on foot." "And did you get a look at the driver?" "Yes, sir. As he exited the vehicle, I saw him clearly under the parking lot lights. It was the defendant, Darius Cole." "You're certain?" 100%, Ruiz said with unflinching confidence. Bailey smiled. "The prosecution also has fingerprint evidence, lifted directly from the steering wheel, which forensics confirmed belonged to Mr. Cole, and we have surveillance footage from a corner store a block away, showing Mr. Cole running, or, as the state contends, fleeing in the direction of his home just minutes after the car was abandoned." He turned to the judge. "The state's evidence is conclusive, Your Honor. A clear-cut case." Judge Harden nodded, looking thoroughly unimpressed and bored. "Mr. Cole," he sighed, "you may cross-examine the witness." Darius rose from his chair, his movements deliberate and calm. He carried a single manila folder, from which he took a sheet of paper. He didn't approach the witness stand with aggression, but with a quiet, scholarly focus that was unnerving in its intensity. The courtroom, which had settled into a state of drowsy certainty, began to stir with a new curiosity. "Officer Ruiz," Darius started, his voice polite but firm, "you testified that you were the one who initiated the pursuit. Is that correct?" "Yes. And your patrol car is equipped with a standard GPS tracking system, which logs your vehicle's location and timestamps, correct?" Ruiz shifted in his seat. "Yes, all city patrol cars are. And that data is a matter of public record, available through a formal request, which I filed last week." Darius placed the paper on the witness stand. "This is a certified copy of your vehicle's GPS log from the night of April 28th. Could you please read the entry for 9:15 p.m., the time the 911 call was placed?" Ruiz's eyes scanned the document. A bead of sweat trickled down his temple. Bailey, sensing a problem, started to rise, but Judge Harden waved him down, a flicker of interest finally piercing his veil of indifference. It says my vehicle was at a traffic stop on Route 29, Ruiz mumbled, his voice suddenly losing its authoritative edge. "Route 29, Darius repeated, letting the words settle. "Which is nearly 3 miles away from Preston Avenue, on the opposite side of town. And the log shows you didn't clear that stop until 9:32 p.m. The stolen Lexus was abandoned at 9:28 p.m. So, I'll ask you again, Officer Ruiz. How could you have possibly initiated a pursuit on Preston Avenue when, according to your own department's verified data, you were miles away?" The officer stammered, his face turning a blotchy red. "There must be a mistake, a clerical error that places you at the scene of a crime you couldn't have witnessed." Darius pressed gently. "Or is it perhaps that you weren't the one who identified the driver? Is it possible you're just repeating what you were told by another officer? An Officer Miller, perhaps, who was actually the one on the scene?" Ruiz's silence was a confession. Ethan Bailey was on his feet now. "Objection! Your Honor, the defendant is badgering the witness. The defendant is asking pertinent questions, Mr. Bailey." "Overruled," Judge Harden said, his eyes now fixed on Darius with a newfound focus. The golf game was, for the moment, forgotten. Darius didn't gloat. He simply moved on to his next point. "Let's talk about the fingerprints. The report states my prints were found on the steering wheel. That is true, I don't deny it. But the report also states, on page 3, that there were several other sets of unidentified prints found on the door handle, the gear shift, and the rear view mirror. Is that correct? Bailey sighed. Your Honor, this is irrelevant. It's highly relevant, Darius countered, turning to the judge. The prosecution wants you to believe that my prints on the wheel are proof of guilt. But I work as a part-time valet at the Omni Hotel downtown. The owner of the Lexus, Mr. Abernathy, is a regular guest. I parked his car just 2 days before it was stolen. My fingerprints being on the steering wheel doesn't prove I stole it. It proves I did my job. A wave of murmurs washed over the courtroom. Maya Cole allowed herself a small, proud smile. Judge Hardin leaned forward, his chin resting on his hand, the mocking smirk completely gone, replaced by an expression of intense concentration. Darius continued, his momentum building. And now the surveillance video. Mr. Bailey described it as footage of me fleeing. I'd like to play that video for the court. The grainy footage flickered to life on the monitors. It showed Darius in his valet uniform, walking, not running, down the sidewalk. He looked tired. A bus pulled up to the stop where he was waiting, and he got on. The timestamp on the video read 9:35 p.m. The video shows me waiting for my bus to go home after my shift ended at 9:30 p.m., a fact my manager has confirmed in a sworn affidavit, Darius explained calmly. The Rose Hill apartment complex, where the car was abandoned, is 6 blocks in the opposite direction from this bus stop. The prosecution claims I was fleeing the scene, but the evidence shows I was simply a young man going home from work. He turned back to the prosecutor's table, his gaze locking with Ethan Bailey's. Bailey's confident smirk had vanished, replaced by a tight, defensive line. He looked flustered, unprepared for such a systematic dismantling of his open and shut case. Darius saved his final, most powerful point for last. He walked back to his table and picked up another document from his folder. Your Honor, there is one last piece of evidence the prosecution seems to have overlooked, or perhaps ignored. The initial 911 call from the car's owner, Mr. Abernathy. I have the transcript right here. He held it up. When the dispatcher asked for a description of the person who stole his car, a man he saw speeding away from his driveway, he gave a very specific one. Darius's voice dropped, becoming grave and clear. He said, and I quote, "He was a white male, maybe in his 20s, wearing a red hoodie." A white male. He placed the transcript on the railing of the jury box, even though it was empty. The gesture was for the judge, for the gallery, for everyone who had judged him before he'd said a word. The prosecution has an officer who lied about his location, fingerprint evidence that has an innocent explanation, a video that disproves their timeline, and a witness description of the actual thief that they completely disregarded. So, the question isn't whether I'm guilty. The question is, why was I arrested in the first place? And why is the district attorney's office so determined to prosecute me when the actual evidence points somewhere else entirely? The silence in the courtroom was absolute. It was no longer the silence of boredom, but the heavy, ringing silence of shock and dawning realization. The voice that had been so easily dismissed was now the only one that mattered. Darius Cole, the boy in the borrowed suit, had just taken control of the entire courtroom. The immediate aftermath of Darius's meticulously structured presentation was a palpable shift in the courtroom's gravitational field. The center of power, once firmly seated with the judge and the prosecutor, had drifted, settling squarely on the shoulders of the 19-year-old at the defendant's table. Ethan Bailey, who had begun the day with the predatory grace of a shark, now looked like a man who had been unexpectedly pulled from the water and was gasping for air. His confidence, the very armor he wore into battle, was riddled with cracks. He rose to his feet, attempting a recovery. His voice, usually so resonant and commanding, was a fraction thinner. Your Honor, the defendant is cherry-picking details and creating a narrative of confusion. The fact remains that Officer Ruiz did identify him. The GPS log could be faulty. The valet story is a convenient, unverifiable alibi. It is verifiable, Mr. Bailey, Judge Hardin interjected, his voice sharp. He turned to the bailiff. "Get me the clerk's office on the line. I want them to run a diagnostic check on the timestamp accuracy for GPS Unit 734. Now." He then swiveled his gaze back to Bailey. "And as for the valet story, did your office make any attempt to contact Mr. Cole's employer at the Omni Hotel?" Bailey's face tightened. He shuffled his papers, a nervous gesture that did not go unnoticed. "Your Honor, given the strength of the other evidence, the fingerprints, the officer's positive ID, we felt it was an unnecessary line of inquiry." "Unnecessary?" Hardin repeated, his voice laced with a dangerous calm. "You had a suspect in custody, and you didn't think it was necessary to corroborate or disprove his alibi? You had an eyewitness description of the thief that completely contradicts your suspect's appearance, and you dismissed it? Mr. Bailey, this is starting to sound less like a prosecution and more like a witch hunt." The judge's words struck Bailey like a physical blow. To be reprimanded so severely, so publicly, was a humiliation he had never before experienced. His arrogance crumbled, revealing a raw, defensive anger underneath. He was losing, and he knew it. The case he had considered a mere stepping stone, a quick and easy conviction to pad his stats, was unraveling thread by thread, pulled by the steady hands of a teenager. From the gallery, the atmosphere had transformed from one of cynical entertainment to rapt attention. The court watchers who had come for a bit of drama were now leaning forward, their faces a mixture of astonishment and dawning respect. Darius's neighbors, who had arrived with fear in their hearts, now watched with a swelling sense of pride. They saw not just Darius, the quiet boy from down the street, but a warrior standing against a giant, and in the front row, Maya Cole sat perfectly still, a silent storm of emotion contained within her. Tears welled in her eyes, but she would not let them fall. She watched her son, not with surprise, but with profound validation. This was the boy she had raised. This was the man she knew him to be. She had poured into him every lesson she had learned from a life of struggle and activism. To meet ignorance with intelligence, to meet arrogance with facts, and to meet hatred with an unshakable belief in one's own worth. Seeing him now, so poised and powerful, was the culmination of every sacrifice, every late-night study session, every difficult conversation about the world he would have to face. A court clerk entered the room and handed a note to the bailiff, who passed it up to the judge. Hardin read it, his expression hardening. "Mr. Bailey?" the judge said, his voice now cold as steel. "The clerk's office has just confirmed the GPS data from Officer Ruiz's vehicle is accurate. They report no system malfunctions on the night of April 28th. The officer was, as Mr. Cole stated, 3 miles away." He let the fact hang in the air, a guillotine over the prosecution's case. "So, not only did your office fail to do its due diligence, but your primary witness has perjured himself on the stand." The room was deathly quiet. Officer Ruiz, who was still sitting near the prosecutor's table, seemed to shrink into himself, his face pale. The foundation of the state's case had just been blasted into dust. Judge Hardin removed his glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose, looking suddenly weary. The rigid certainty he had carried into the courtroom was gone. He had presided over thousands of cases, seen every kind of lawyer from the brilliant to the bumbling. But he had never seen anything like this. He had looked at Darius Cole and seen a statistic, a stereotype. He had allowed his own biases, his own impatience, to color his judgment before the first word of testimony was even spoken. The boy's calm, logical demolition of the case against him was also, Hardin realized, a quiet dismantling of his own prejudices. He looked at Darius, truly looked at him, for the first time. He saw not a delinquent, but a mind of formidable clarity. He saw not a defendant, but a masterful advocate. The sarcasm and mockery he had wielded earlier now felt cheap and shameful. The boy hadn't just been defending his freedom. He had been holding up a mirror to the entire room, forcing them to see the cracks in a system they had all taken for granted. "Mr. Cole," the judge said, his voice softer now, stripped of its earlier condescension. "Do you have anything further to add?" Darius rose slowly. The victory was almost his. He could feel it. But there was one more piece that needed to be put in place. It wasn't enough to prove his innocence. He had to expose the reason he was here in the first place. "Yes, Your Honor," he said, turning his gaze back to Ethan Bailey, who looked away, unable to meet his eyes. "I do." The shift was complete. The armor of the prosecution was broken. The judge's preconceptions were shattered, and the courtroom waited, holding its collective breath, to hear what the boy who had defied all expectations would say next. The air in the courtroom was now charged with a different kind of tension. It was no longer the simple drama of guilt or innocence, but the heavier, more complex weight of accusation. Not against Darius, but against the system that had put him on trial. Darius stood in the center of that tension, a fulcrum upon which the entire proceeding now balanced. He held no papers, no evidence. His next argument would come not from a folder, but from the heart of the injustice itself. He took a step away from the defendant's table, a move that subtly closed the distance between him and Ethan Bailey. His voice, when he spoke, was not raised in anger. It was measured, analytical, yet it carried an emotional resonance that cut through the sterile legal environment. "Your Honor, for the past hour, we have picked apart the state's case. We've shown that their star witness lied under oath. We've shown that their physical evidence has an innocent explanation. We've shown that their video evidence actually supports my alibi. And we've shown that they had a clear description of the actual perpetrator, a description they chose to ignore." He paused, letting the summary sink in. Judge Hardin listened, his expression somber and deeply focused. He was no longer a man in a hurry. He was a man bearing witness. "This raises a fundamental question," Darius continued, his eyes finally locking on Ethan Bailey, who stood frozen by the prosecutor's table. "Why? Why would the district attorney's office pursue a case with so little credible evidence? Why would they ignore exculpatory evidence that pointed away from me? Why arrest me, a young man with no criminal record, walking home from his job, for a crime committed by someone who looks nothing like me?" Darius took another slow step forward. "I believe the answer is a difficult one, but one that everyone in this room understands on some level. The answer is that it was easy." Bailey's head snapped up. "Objection! Your Honor, the defendant is speculating. He's making baseless accusations about the prosecution's motives." "Is it baseless, Mr. Bailey?" Darius shot back, his voice rising in intensity for the first time. "Or is it a pattern? When the initial police report came in, Officer Miller, the officer who was actually on the scene, saw me walking a few blocks away. I fit a vague, generalized description. Young and black. It didn't matter that the eyewitness said the thief was white. It didn't matter that I was in my work uniform. I was a convenient target, an easy arrest to close a case." He turned to address the judge and the gallery, his voice ringing with a conviction born of lived experience. "And once the arrest was made, the system did what it does. It built a case around the suspect it already had, instead of finding the suspect that fit the evidence. They twisted my presence on the street into fleeing. They used my fingerprints, innocently placed, as a tool of condemnation. They took Officer Ruiz's second-hand account and presented it as gospel because the system protects its own. This was the turning point. Darius was no longer just defending himself. He was indicting the very prejudice that had fueled his prosecution. He was giving voice to the unspoken reality that men who looked like him faced every day, a presumption of guilt that often rendered facts irrelevant. "So I ask you directly, Mr. Bailey," Darius said, his voice dropping to a powerful, penetrating quiet. "Did you even read the full witness statement from Mr. Abernathy? Did you pause for even one moment and question why the evidence didn't line up? Or did you look at my face, look at my address, and see a statistic? Did you ignore the testimony that would have cleared me because it was simply easier to convict a young black man from the south side of Charlottesville? The question was an earthquake. It shook the foundations of the courtroom. It was a direct, unflinching challenge to the prosecutor's integrity and the racial bias that permeated the justice system. Ethan Bailey stood speechless, his face a mask of fury and humiliation. He had no answer, because any answer he gave would be an admission of either incompetence or prejudice. Judge Hardin watched the exchange, his face grim. He knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that this trial was no longer routine. It had transcended the docket number and the specific charges. It had become a raw, public exposure of the system's deepest flaws. He, too, was complicit. His initial mockery of Darius, his impatience to get to his golf game, his immediate assumption of the boy's guilt, it was all part of the same corrosive prejudice. He had been a willing cog in the very machine Darius was now describing. The realization was profoundly humbling. This trial was no longer about a stolen car. It was about the theft of something far more valuable, the promise of equal justice. Darius Cole had reframed the entire narrative. He had shown that his fight for his own innocence was inextricably linked to a much larger fight against a prejudice that was as old as the nation itself. He wasn't just asking for a verdict of not guilty. He was demanding that the court acknowledge the injustice of how he got here. "I am innocent of these charges, Your Honor," Darius said, his voice returning to its steady calm as he concluded his argument. "But this case has revealed a guilt that extends far beyond this courtroom. It is the guilt of a system that too often sacrifices truth for the sake of convenience and justice for the sake of statistics." He walked back to his table and sat down. He had said all he needed to say. The silence that followed was heavy with the weight of his words. There were no more objections, no more arguments. There was only the truth, stark and undeniable, hanging in the air for all to see. The heart of the matter had been laid bare. The courtroom felt like a vacuum, all the air sucked out by the force of Darius's final question. Ethan Bailey remained standing, but he was a statue of a man, his authority shattered. Judge Hardin gave him a long, appraising look, a silent opportunity to respond, to defend his office, to offer any rebuttal that could possibly salvage his case. Bailey opened his mouth, but no words came out. He looked at his notes, but the familiar script was useless now. The facts had been recontextualized, the narrative stolen from him. All he had left was the hollow shell of a prosecution. With a slight shake of his head, he slowly sat down, a public concession of defeat. Judge Hardin turned his attention back to Darius. The transformation in the judge's demeanor was total. The cynicism was gone, replaced by a profound gravity. He saw the courtroom not as his personal fiefdom, but as a sacred space that had been violated by prejudice and carelessness, partly by his own. "Mr. Cole," Hardin began, his voice low and deliberate, "you have presented a compelling defense. You have raised not just reasonable doubt, but a mountain of it. You have demonstrated a failure of due diligence on the part of the prosecution and exposed a severe discrepancy in the testimony of the arresting officer." He paused, taking off his glasses again and setting them down on the bench. He seemed to be speaking not just as a judge, but as a man grappling with a difficult truth. This court is not just a place for rules and procedures. It is, at its core, a place for truth. The truth of what happened on the night of April 28th has been willfully obscured by those who were sworn to seek it. Officer Ruiz did not witness the crime. The fingerprint evidence is circumstantial and explainable. The surveillance footage contradicts the state's timeline. And the initial eyewitness description, the purest piece of evidence in the entire case, was inexplicably ignored. Each point he listed was a nail in the coffin of the prosecution's case. He was not just summarizing the facts, He was validating every argument Darius had made. He was publicly acknowledging the legitimacy of the defense that he had, just an hour ago, openly mocked. "The standard for a criminal conviction is proof beyond a reasonable doubt," Judge Harden continued, his gaze sweeping across the courtroom, from Bailey to Ruiz, and finally resting on Darius. "The state has not come close to meeting that standard. In fact, the evidence presented here today suggests that the only thing connecting Mr. Cole to this crime is the fact that he was in the wrong place at the wrong time, with the wrong skin color." The judge's blunt assessment sent another shockwave through the room. For a sitting judge to so openly call out the role of racial bias in a prosecution was almost unheard of. It was a stunning indictment, delivered from the very seat of power. Ethan Bailey visibly flinched, his face turning a deep shade of crimson. He was being professionally dismantled, his career prospects dimming with every word the judge uttered. Officer Ruiz stared at the floor, the weight of his perjury and its consequences pressing down on him. For Darius, it was a moment of surreal vindication. He had walked into this room expecting a battle, prepared to lose but determined to fight. He had not expected an ally on the bench. He had sought to create reasonable doubt in the judge's mind. He had not imagined he would ignite the judge's conscience. He looked over at his mother. Maya's composure had finally broken. Silent tears streamed down her cheeks. Tears not of sorrow, but of overwhelming relief and pride. Her son had done more than save himself. He had forced the system to look at itself in the mirror. "Therefore," Judge Harden said, his voice rising to a formal, authoritative tone as he picked up his gavel. The sound it would make was no longer a threat, but a promise of liberation. "It is the finding of this court that the prosecution has failed to provide sufficient evidence to proceed. The foundation of their case is built on false testimony and investigative negligence." He looked directly at Darius, a flicker of something that looked like awe in his eyes. "Darius Cole, you have represented yourself with more skill, more integrity, and more dedication to the truth than many seasoned attorneys I have seen in my 30 years on the bench." The compliment, coming from the man who had so viciously belittled him, was the final, definitive sign that the world had tilted on its axis. "All charges against you are hereby dismissed. You are free to go." He brought the gavel down. Crack! The sound was clean, final, and absolute. It was the sound of chains breaking. The sharp crack of the gavel sliced through the tense silence, and for a heartbeat, no one moved. It was as if the courtroom collectively needed a moment to process the totality of what had just happened. Then, the spell broke. A wave of sound washed over the room, gasps of relief, applause breaking out from the gallery, a sob of pure, unadulterated joy from Maya Cole. The courtroom erupted. Darius's neighbors were on their feet, cheering and clapping, their faces transformed by smiles. Reporters, who had been lazily taking notes on what they assumed was a routine case, were now scrambling, whispering urgently into their phones. They knew they had just witnessed something extraordinary. This wasn't just an acquittal. It was a story. Darius sat frozen in his chair for a second longer, the judge's words echoing in his mind. "You are free to go." The simple phrase held the weight of a lifetime. He felt a tremor run through him as the adrenaline that had sustained him for weeks finally began to recede, leaving a profound sense of exhaustion and overwhelming relief in its wake. He had won. He had actually won. He pushed his chair back and stood up, turning toward his mother. Maya was already moving toward him, her arms outstretched. They met in a fierce, desperate embrace in the middle of the aisle. Darius buried his face in her shoulder, the disciplined composure he had maintained for so long finally cracking. He held on to her as if she were the only solid thing in a world that had been spinning out of control. "You did it," Maya whispered into his ear, her voice thick with tears. "Oh, my baby, you did it. You stood for truth. You stood for justice. You stood for millions of unheard voices today. I am so proud of you." He pulled back, his own eyes wet. "I was so scared, Mama." "I know," she said, cupping his face in her hands. "Courage isn't the absence of fear, Darius. It's acting in spite of it. And what you did today, it was the bravest thing I have ever seen." Across the room, Ethan Bailey was packing his briefcase with frantic, jerky movements, his face a thunderous mask of humiliation. He avoided eye contact with everyone, a man desperate to flee the scene of his own professional detonation. Judge Hardin watched him go, his expression one of weary disappointment. This was the outcome of lazy, biased prosecution. This was the damage it could do, not just to the wrongly accused, but to the credibility of the entire institution. The judge's gaze then fell on Darius and his mother. He saw their tearful embrace, the raw, powerful emotion of a family that had stared into the abyss and survived. He felt a pang of something he hadn't felt in years, a deep, humbling sense of shame for his own part in their ordeal. His initial prejudice, his cutting remarks, they had added to the mountain of injustice this young man had been forced to climb. Slowly, deliberately, Judge Hardin stood up and stepped down from the bench. It was a breach of protocol, a gesture he never made. The remaining people in the courtroom quieted, watching as he walked not toward his chambers, but across the courtroom floor, directly toward Darius. The bailiff took a protective step forward, but the judge waved him off. He stopped a few feet from Darius and Maya, who turned to face him, their expressions wary. Judge Hardin looked at Darius, his eyes stripped of all judicial artifice. He looked like an old man who had been forced to confront a lifetime of his own certainties and find them wanting. "Mr. Cole," he said, his voice quiet and raspy, filled with a sincerity that was utterly disarming. I owe you an apology." The admission hung in the air, more shocking than the verdict itself. "My conduct at the beginning of this trial was inexcusable," Hardin continued, his gaze unwavering. "I judged you before I heard a single word from you. I let my own cynicism and prejudice cloud my duty. What you did here today was more than just defend yourself. You reminded me of what justice is supposed to be about. It's not about expediency or statistics. It's about truth. You fought for the truth with a clarity and a passion that was profound. You have taught an old man a lesson he should have learned long ago." Darius was speechless. He could only nod, accepting the apology with a grace that belied his age. The judge wasn't finished. A small, genuine smile touched his lips for the first time that day. "When I suggested you weren't in a high school debate club, I was wrong. You were teaching a master class. Have you ever considered a career in law?" Darius looked at his mother, then back at the judge. "A little," he admitted. "You should do more than consider it," Hardin said with conviction. "You have a brilliant legal mind, Mr. Cole, but more importantly, you have a deep and abiding sense of what is right. You have the heart and the brilliance to change lives, to fix the very cracks in the system that you expose today. The world needs lawyers like you. Our country needs them." It was an extraordinary moment. The biased authority figure had transformed into a humbled mentor. The verdict had been delivered, but the real judgment had been passed on the system itself and on the man who represented it. The judge who had mocked a teen was now championing his future, a future that, thanks to Darius's own courage, was once again his to command. The weight of Judge Hardin's words settled over Darius, a strange and unexpected blessing after the storm. An apology from the man who held his fate in his hands was something he had never imagined. The encouragement, the genuine respect, it was a balm on the wounds of the past few weeks. This was more than an acquittal. It was a restoration of his dignity, a public acknowledgement of his worth. "Thank you, Your Honor," Darius finally managed to say, his voice steady despite the whirlwind of emotions inside him. "That means a lot." Hardin nodded, his expression still etched with a deep sincerity. "The honor was all mine, son. to witness it. He glanced at Maya, a silent acknowledgement of her role in shaping the young man before him. "Mrs. Cole, you have raised an exceptional man." Maya, who had faced down bigots and politicians with unshakable resolve, found herself momentarily lost for words. She simply inclined her head in a gesture of maternal pride and gratitude. The judge seemed to understand that the family needed their moment. With a final respectful nod to Darius, he turned and walked slowly toward his chambers, no longer the imperious figure from the bench, but a man visibly changed, walking with the heavy tread of someone who had been forced to re-examine the very foundations of his life's work. He had built a career on judgment, but in the end, it was he who had been judged, and found wanting by the simple, powerful truth spoken by a 19-year-old boy. He had not gone to his golf game. Instead, he had been given a lesson in humility, a far more valuable use of his afternoon. As soon as the judge was gone, the gallery surged forward. Neighbors clapped Darius on the shoulder, their faces beaming. Reporters clamored for a statement, microphones and cameras appearing as if from nowhere. The small, oppressive courtroom was suddenly a chaotic hub of celebration and media frenzy. "Darius, how does it feel? What are you going to do now? Do you plan to file a civil suit against the city?" The questions came in a rapid-fire barrage. Darius felt a hand on his arm and saw his mother guiding him through the crowd, creating a path through the noise. "Let's get some air," she said, her voice a calm anchor in the swirling chaos. They pushed through the heavy doors and stepped out onto the courthouse steps. The rain had stopped. The clouds were beginning to break, and a fragile, watery sunlight was filtering through, making the wet pavement gleam. The air was fresh and clean, washed new. Darius took a deep breath, filling his lungs with the air of a free man. It had never tasted so sweet. They stood there for a moment, just the two of them, watching the world go on. Cars passed on the street, people hurried along the sidewalks, life continued. But for Darius, everything had changed. He felt older, as if the trial had been a crucible that had burned away his youth and forged something harder, stronger, and more purposeful in its place. "He was right, you know," Darius said quietly, looking out at the city. "Who was?" Maya asked, following his gaze. "Judge Harden. About me becoming a lawyer." He turned to her, a new certainty dawning in his eyes. "All those nights you had me reading Thurgood Marshall's arguments, studying the Constitution. I thought you were just trying to keep me educated, keep me safe. But you were preparing me for this, weren't you?" "All along," Maya smiled. A gentle, knowing smile. "I was preparing you for the world, Darius. I knew the world would not always be fair to you. I knew it would challenge you and test you in ways it wouldn't test others. I wanted you to have the tools not just to survive, but to fight back. To demand justice. What you do with those tools is up to you." He looked down at his hands, the hands that had been accused of theft, but had instead dismantled a legal case. He had always thought of his future in simple terms. Finish community college, maybe get a business degree, find a steady job. But the vision Judge Harden had offered him felt right. It felt like a calling. To stand for others as he had stood for himself. To be the voice for those who were silenced. "I'm going to do it, Mom," he said with a sudden, fierce determination. "I'm going to law school. I'm going to become a defense attorney. I'm going to stand in rooms like that one, and I'm going to fight for every single person who gets looked at the way they looked at me today." His declaration was a vow, made on the steps of the very building that had sought to condemn him. It was a promise to turn his pain into purpose. Maya wrapped her arm around his shoulders, pulling him close. "I know you will," she said softly. "And you will be a brilliant one." A bridge had been built in that courtroom, a fragile, unexpected bridge of humility between a cynical old judge and a resilient young man. And now, standing in the clean, post-storm air, Darius Cole was ready to walk across it, leaving behind the boy who was accused and stepping into the future of the man he was destined to become. The story of what happened in Judge Hardin's courtroom spread through Charlottesville like wildfire. It was on the local news that evening, the headline, "Stark and Compelling. Teenager represents self, dismantles prosecution in stolen car case." It was the talk of barbershops and coffee shops, of church gatherings and community centers. It was more than just a local news item. It became a parable, a modern-day David and Goliath story that resonated deeply in a city still healing from its own well-publicized battles with racial injustice. Darius Cole became an unintentional symbol. To some, he was a prodigy, a legal genius in the making. To others, he was a hero, a young man who had stared down the monolithic power of the state and made it blink. But to the kids in his neighborhood, the ones who walked the same streets and faced the same unspoken suspicions, he was something more powerful. He was proof. Proof that you didn't have to be a victim. Proof that knowledge was a weapon that anyone could wield. Proof that their voices, if used with courage and clarity, could be heard and could, against all odds, make a difference. He walked out of the courthouse that day, not just as a free man, but as a spark. In the days that followed, the consequences of the trial continued to ripple outward. Officer Marcus Ruiz was suspended pending an internal investigation for perjury. The district attorney's office, facing a public relations nightmare, quietly launched a review of their case vetting procedures. The story was a stark reminder that prejudice wasn't always loud and violent. Sometimes it was quiet, insidious, and dressed in the robes of administrative efficiency. It was the simple, lazy choice to ignore a fact because it complicated a clean arrest. A few weeks later, a thick envelope arrived at the Coles' small apartment. It was from the University of Virginia School of Law. Inside was a personal letter from the dean, who had read about the case in the newspaper. The letter spoke of Darius's extraordinary display of innate legal talent and moral clarity. It ended with an invitation to apply for a special scholarship funded by an anonymous donor designed for students who showed exceptional promise in the pursuit of civil rights and justice. Darius knew, with a certainty that made him smile, who the anonymous donor was. The trial of Darius Cole became a turning point, a small but significant shift in the city's consciousness. It didn't solve the deep, systemic issues of racial bias overnight, but it started a conversation. It forced people to confront uncomfortable truths. The gray, oppressive clouds of prejudice that had hung over the city seemed, for the first time in a long time, to have a silver lining. A spark of hope had been lit, and its glow was cast by the silhouette of a 19-year-old boy who had refused to be just another statistic. Darius accepted the offer. He knew the road ahead would be long and difficult, filled with challenges far greater than the one he had just overcome. But he was no longer afraid. He had found his purpose on the polished floors of a courtroom that was meant to be the end of his story. Instead, it was just the beginning. He would walk into many more courtrooms in his life, but he would enter them not as the accused, but as the defender, carrying with him the memory of his own trial, a reminder of what was at stake, and a testament to the enduring power of one voice speaking the truth in a room full of doubt. The city of Charlottesville, once a symbol of division, now carried a new story within it. A story of a young man who fought the system and, in doing so, began to change it from the inside out. Darius Cole's victory was more than just a personal triumph. It was a powerful blow against the quiet bigotry that so often hides within the justice system. He walked out of the courthouse not just a free man, but a beacon of hope for his community, proving that courage, intelligence, and an unwavering belief in the truth can indeed level the playing field. His journey from defendant to future defender ignited a crucial conversation in Charlottesville, turning a moment of profound injustice into a catalyst for change. Darius's story is a vital reminder that one person's conviction can challenge a nation's conscience. If this story inspired you, please hit the like button, share it with others who need to hear it, and subscribe for more content that champions the fight for justice.